A man who had locked his heart in ice for 10 years. A woman who crawled through a killer blizzard, not to save herself, but to make sure her babies were warm before she died in the snow. He found her frozen. He found the children. And tucked between them, a single, desperate note that said only 5 words: "Please love them." What happens next will break you, and then put you back together stronger than before. This story reminds us that the most frozen hearts are often the ones capable of the greatest love. They just need the right storm to bring them back to life. If this story warmed something inside you, leave a heart below and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
Elias Thorne hadn't lit the hearth in the front parlor for 10 winters. Not until the coldest dawn of the decade, when a sound from the barn forced him to reach for his Winchester. Outside the frosted glass of his cabin window, the Wyoming territory was drowning in a sea of blinding, violent white. The blizzard had been howling for 2 days, a relentless beast tearing across the plains, burying fence lines and freezing livestock where they stood. Elias was used to the cold. He had let it settle into his bones a decade ago, matching the frost that had encased his heart the day the winter took his wife and son. He was pouring a cup of bitter day-old coffee when he heard it. It was faint, barely cutting through the shrieking wind that rattled the log walls. A high, thin cry. Elias froze. His hand tightened around the tin mug. A coyote? A trapped calf? The sound came again, sharper this time, carrying a desperate, unmistakable cadence that made the blood in his veins run like ice water. It wasn't an animal. Elias set the mug down hard, coffee sloshing over the wood table. He grabbed his heavy buffalo hide coat, shoved his feet into his boots, and pulled his hat down low over his scarred brow. Snatching the Winchester rifle from its mount by the door, he threw his shoulder against the heavy oak and shoved it open into the teeth of the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Snow blinded him instantly, stinging his cheeks like crushed glass. He lowered his head, using the rope line he'd strung between the porch and the barn to guide him through the waist-high drifts. Every step was a battle against the howling white. When he finally reached the barn, he hauled the heavy sliding door open just enough to slip inside, shoving it shut behind him to cut off the wind. The barn was pitch black, smelling of sweet hay, damp earth, and the nervous musk of the horses. He struck a match with a numb thumb and lit a lantern. The golden light flared, pushing back the shadows. The cry sounded again. It was coming from the empty foaling stall at the far end. Elias cocked the lever of the Winchester, a harsh metallic clack that usually sent trespassers running. Nobody moved. Keeping the rifle leveled, he stepped cautiously down the center aisle. When he reached the stall, he lowered the lantern over the wooden gate. His breath caught in his throat. There, nestled in the center of the straw, was a bundle of thick, raw sheep's wool. The bundle was squirming. Elias lowered the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He knelt in the hay, peeling back the heavy, snow-dusted wool with a leather-gloved hand. Twins. 2 tiny, red-faced infants, barely a month old, were huddled together for warmth. One was wailing, a furious, fist-pumping demand for life. The other was eerily quiet, lips tinged a dangerous pale blue. "Dear God," Elias rasped, his voice rough from years of disuse. Tucked between them, pinned to the blanket with a rusted safety pin, was a piece of parchment. Elias pulled his glove off with his teeth and picked it up with a shaking hand. The ink was smeared from the melting snow, but the frantic, elegant handwriting was still legible. "Please love them." That was it. No names, no explanations. Just a desperate plea left in the dark. A ghost of a memory threatened to rise in his mind. A tiny, cold hand slipping from his grasp 10 years ago, but Elias brutally shoved it down. There was no time for ghosts. Not when there was life fading right in front of him. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and gathered the heavy bundle into his arms, tucking the wool tightly around their fragile faces to shield them from the storm. They were so small, so impossibly light. "Hold on," he murmured to the bundle, his jaw set in a grim line. "Just hold on." He kicked the barn door open and stepped back into the massacre of the blizzard. The wind roared, immediately trying to tear the bundle from his grip. Elias hunched over them, making his own broad chest a shield, and began to force his way back through the drifts. He made it 5 yards before his boot struck something solid beneath a fresh snowbank. Elias stumbled, barely catching his balance to keep from dropping the babies. He cursed, looking down. It wasn't a frozen log, it wasn't a dead calf. Through the swirling snow, a patch of dark, frozen fabric was visible. Balancing the babies in his left arm, Elias dropped to one knee and used his right hand to furiously sweep the snow away. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball facing the barn, as if she had used her last ounce of strength to make sure her children were inside before her body finally gave out. Her dark hair was matted with ice, her skin as pale and fragile as porcelain. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. Elias pressed his bare fingers to the icy skin of her neck. It was faint, so faint he almost missed it beneath the howling wind. But there was a pulse, a stubborn refusal to die flutter. "Damn it," Elias swore into the wind. He couldn't leave her. The winter had taken enough from him. He would be damned to hell before he let it take a mother on his land. Hooking his right arm under her waist, Elias hauled the woman up. She was dangerously light, nothing but fine bones and sheer will. With the twin babies securely clamped to his chest and the unconscious woman slung heavily over his shoulder, Elias Thorne stood up against the full fury of the Wyoming blizzard. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what kind of hell she was running from. But as he kicked his cabin door open and carried them over the threshold into the dark, freezing house, Elias knew one thing for certain. He was going to have to light the parlor hearth. The parlor of Elias Thorne's cabin had been a tomb for 10 years. But tonight, it had to be a sanctuary. Elias dropped his heavy burden onto the woven rug before the stone hearth. His hands, numb and bleeding from the cold, fumbled with the matches. He struck one, then another, cursing as the sulfur head snapped. Finally, a spark caught the dry tinder. Flames leapt upward, casting wild, dancing shadows against the log walls, illuminating the dust of a decade of solitude. He didn't waste a second. Elias pulled a heavy wooden drawer from the bottom of an oak dresser, lined it with his thickest flannel shirts, and carefully placed the squirming bundle of sheep's wool inside. The babies were wailing now, a thin, reedy sound that tore at the silence of the cabin. I know, Elias muttered, his voice gravelly. He pushed the drawer close to the hearth, but not too close, ensuring the radiant heat would warm them gradually. Then he turned to the woman. She lay perfectly still on the rug, a frozen statue carved from desperation. Elias dropped to his knees beside her. Her woolen coat was a solid sheet of ice, stiff as armor. If he didn't get the wet layers off her, she would die of exposure right there on his floor. Swallowing his hesitation, Elias pulled his hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the frozen laces of her ruined leather boots, tossing them aside. He peeled off her ice-caked coat and the sodden shawl beneath it, leaving her in a simple, damp cotton dress. She was agonizingly thin, her collarbones sharp beneath the fabric. Elias grabbed the thick wool quilt from his own bed and wrapped her in it tightly, lifting her slightly to slide a pillow beneath her head. Her skin was the color of skim milk, her lips a bruised purple. He rubbed her hands briskly between his large, calloused palms, trying to force the blood back into her extremities. "Come on," he urged the unconscious woman, his jaw clenching. "You didn't fight through that storm just to die on my rug. Breathe." For a long, terrifying moment, the only sound was the shriek of the blizzard outside and the frantic cries of the infants. Then the woman drew a sharp, jagged breath. Her chest arched off the floor as a violent shiver racked her small frame. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of dark winter storm clouds. For a second they were vacant, unfocused. Then a raw, primal terror seized her features. She shot up, fighting the heavy quilt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No! Let me go! The babies!" "Easy." Elias caught her shoulders, his large hands firm but gentle, pinning her back down. "You're safe. Look at me. You are safe." Clara thrashed against his grip, her eyes wide and wild, unseeing. "He'll take them. Where are they?" "They're right here," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble that usually calmed spooked horses. He pointed toward the hearth. "Look." Clara's gaze tracked his pointing finger. She saw the wooden drawer, heard the distinct, demanding wails of the twins, and the fight instantly drained out of her. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound relief that it made Elias's chest ache. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the pain of thawing flesh, and hovered over the makeshift crib. Her trembling hands hovered over their red, tear-streaked faces. She didn't pick them up. She knew she was still too cold. But she leaned close, whispering broken assurances. Elias watched her, his brow furrowed. He stood up, towering over her kneeling form. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone demanding but not unkind. "And what in the hell were you doing out in a whiteout with 2 newborns?" Clara froze. The warmth of the fire was finally penetrating her skin, but a different kind of ice settled in her veins. Silas Blackwood's reach was long. If this man knew who she was, if he knew there was a bounty on her head, he might turn her over to the territorial marshals or Blackwood's hired guns. She couldn't risk the truth. Not yet. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. I found them." Elias frowned, his scarred eyebrow hitching up. "You found them?" "Yes," Clara lied, forcing herself to meet his piercing, pale blue eyes. "I was traveling through to the stagecoach station at Pine Ridge. The storm hit fast. I got turned around off the trail and I heard them crying near your property line. Someone had just left them there." Elias studied her face. He saw the sheer exhaustion, the tremor in her jaw, the shadows of deep, haunting trauma beneath her eyes. It was a flimsy story. "A woman traveling alone in the dead of winter, finding 2 perfectly bundled babies in a blizzard?" But before he could interrogate her further, the baby's cries escalated from distress to frantic, gut-wrenching screams. "They're starving," Elias said, running a hand over his jaw. "I have a milk cow in the barn, but I doubt I can get back out there right now, and cow's milk is too harsh for babies this young anyway. I can try to boil some water and sugar, maybe soak a rag." He sounded helpless, a stark contrast to his imposing, rugged exterior. Clara looked down at the screaming infants. Her breasts ached, heavy and painfully engorged. Her own body was screaming to feed her children. If they didn't eat soon, they would grow too weak to survive the night. She closed her eyes, making a split-second decision. She had to weave another lie into the first to save them. "I can do it," Clara whispered, the words trembling on her lips. Elias stopped mid-stride toward the kitchen area. He turned slowly, his expression utterly blank with shock. "What?" Clara hugged the quilt tighter around her shoulders, her cheeks flushing with a dark, humiliated heat. "I can feed them. I had a baby 3 weeks ago. A little boy." Her voice cracked, the grief she injected into the lie feeling dangerously close to the real grief of her circumstances. "The fever took him before I left on my journey. I still have milk. I can feed them." Elias stared at her. The silence in the cabin stretched, heavy and profound, broken only by the crackle of the burning pine logs and the desperate wails of the twins. He looked at the fragile, freezing woman on his floor, offering a piece of herself, the most intimate, agonizing reminder of a lost child, to save 2 abandoned strangers. Something deep inside Elias Thorne, a thick, protective wall of ice he had spent 10 years building, developed a hairline fracture. He swallowed hard and gave a single stiff nod. I'll go boil some snow for drinking water. You'll need it," Elias mumbled, his voice uncharacteristically thick. He turned on his heel, keeping his broad back strictly to her as he walked into the small kitchen alcove, creating as much distance as the cramped cabin allowed. Clara let out a shaky breath. With trembling, numb fingers, she loosened the bodice of her damp dress. She reached into the drawer, lifting Lily first, guiding the frantic baby to her breast. The infant latched instantly, the screams abruptly cutting off, replaced by the soft, rhythmic sounds of suckling. Standing by the cast-iron stove, Elias gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. He squeezed his eyes shut. The soft, quiet sounds coming from the parlor, the small sighs of the babies, the gentle, soothing hum of the woman's voice, were ghosts invading his sanctuary. It sounded exactly like Eleanor. It sounded like the life he had been robbed of. He had expected the storm to bring death to his door. Instead, it had dragged life, in all its messy, noisy, heartbreaking glory, right into the center of his frozen world. By the morning of the second day, the blizzard had not relented. It threw itself against the sturdy log walls of the Thorn Ranch with the fury of a spurned lover, piling snowdrifts halfway up the frosted windows. Inside the cabin, a suffocating, tense domesticity had taken root. Elias Thorne was a man who required space. For a decade, his routines had been solitary, governed only by the sun and the needs of his livestock. Now, his small sanctuary felt incredibly shrunken. Everywhere he looked, there was evidence of her, a damp dress hanging over a chair back to dry. 2 sleeping infants tucked safely into a drawer at the foot of his bed. And the woman herself moving around his kitchen with a quiet, careful grace that set his teeth on edge. "You don't need to do that," Elias said gruffly. He was sitting at the heavy oak table, meticulously cleaning his Winchester rifle, a task he'd already completed yesterday. Clara paused, a wooden spoon hovering over a cast-iron skillet of sizzling salt pork and beans. She had pinned her dark hair up with a few stray hairpins she'd found in her pocket, exposing the slender, elegant curve of her neck. "I want to help, Mr. Thorne. You gave up your bed for me. You've taken us in. Cooking your breakfast is the least I can do." "I told you, it's Elias," he muttered, snapping the lever of the rifle shut. "And I'm used to my own cooking." "Then you have my sympathies," Clara replied softly, a tiny, unexpected ghost of a smile touching her lips. Elias blinked, caught off guard. He looked up, his pale blue eyes locking onto her face. In the daylight filtering through the snowy windows, he could see her clearly. She couldn't be older than 24. Despite the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes and the pale, pinched look of someone who had known too much hardship, she was strikingly beautiful. It wasn't a fragile beauty, but something resilient, like a desert flower pushing through cracked earth. He quickly looked back down at his rifle, feeling a sudden, unwelcome heat in his chest. "What did you say your name was again?" Clara's hand tightened on the spoon. "Clara," she said, her voice steadying. "Clara Smith." Elias didn't miss the fractional hesitation. Smith, the most common, convenient name a person could grab out of thin air. He knew she was lying. He had known it since she claimed she found 2 perfectly healthy newborns in the middle of a killer storm. But looking at the fierce, protective way she hovered over the babies, the gentle way she sang to them when they fussed in the night, he couldn't bring himself to interrogate her. Not yet. Whatever demons she was running from, the blizzard was keeping them at bay for now. "Well, Clara Smith," Elias said, standing up and dwarfing the small kitchen space, "let's see if your cooking is better than your lying." Clara stiffened, her eyes snapping to his, fear flashing in their gray depths. But Elias just walked past her to grab a tin plate, the faint scent of wood smoke, leather, and pure masculine grit washing over her as he moved. The forced proximity was acting like a pressure cooker. That evening, the tension finally snapped into something entirely different. The wind was howling a mournful tune down the stone chimney. Leo had been fussy all afternoon, crying with a colicky intensity that left Clara exhausted and near tears herself. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, bouncing the infant against her shoulder, murmuring desperate lullabies. But the baby wouldn't settle. Elias, who had been pacing the cabin like a caged bear, finally stopped in front of her. "Give him here," Elias commanded softly. Clara looked up, instinctively tightening her hold on her son. He's just upset. I can soothe him. You're exhausted, Clara. You're tense and he feels it. Hand him over. Elias reached down. His massive, calloused hands, scarred from years of harsh labor and barbed wire, gently slid under the tiny infant. As Clara released the baby, her fingers brushed against Elias's knuckles. A jolt, sharp as static electricity, arched between them. Clara gasped softly, pulling her hand back as if burned. Elias's jaw clenched, his eyes meeting hers for one breathless, suspended second. The air in the cabin suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Without a word, Elias pulled the crying baby to his broad chest. He didn't rock him frantically. Instead, Elias began a slow, heavy, rhythmic sway, his deep voice humming a low, wordless baritone tune that vibrated right through his ribcage into the infant. To Clara's absolute astonishment, within 2 minutes, Leo's cries hitched, faded into soft hiccups, and finally ceased altogether. The baby slumped heavily against Elias's shoulder, fast asleep. Clara watched the towering, gruff rancher handle the fragile child with a tenderness that broke her heart wide open. The firelight cast deep shadows over Elias's face, highlighting the jagged scar that ran through his left eyebrow, but softening the hard lines of his mouth. Guilt, sharp and acidic, clawed at Clara's throat. This man was saving their lives. He was harboring them, feeding them, giving up his own comfort. He was a profoundly good man, buried under layers of grief and ice. And she was deceiving him. She was bringing the wrath of the Blackwood Empire right to his doorstep. Silas Blackwood wouldn't hesitate to burn this cabin to the ground with Elias inside it if he found out the twins were here. "He's asleep," Elias whispered, turning his head to look at her. He caught the tears shining in Clara's eyes before she could look away. Elias frowned, taking a slow step toward her, the sleeping baby secure in one arm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice losing its gruff edge, dropping into something dangerously soft. "Are you in pain?" "No," Clara choked out, wrapping her arms around her own waist. I don't know how to repay you, Elias, for all of this." Elias stood looking down at her, the firelight reflecting in his pale eyes. He thought about the empty, agonizing silence of the past 10 years. He thought about the sudden, terrifying warmth that had bloomed in his chest when her fingers brushed his. "I'm not asking for payment, Clara," Elias said quietly, the space between them shrinking to a mere few inches. "But when this storm breaks, you're going to tell me what you're really running from. Because out here, secrets get people killed." Clara swallowed a sob, staring up at the rugged, scarred face of the man who had just become her only hope in the world. She gave a single terrified nod. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was just beginning to gather. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 4th day, leaving behind a world buried in blinding, diamond-hard white. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he surveyed the aftermath. The Wyoming Territory stretched out before him like a frozen ocean, beautiful and utterly merciless. The snowdrifts were piled high against the barn doors, and the pine trees along the ridge bowed heavily under the weight of the ice. But the sky above was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the sun glared off the crust of the snow with an intensity that made his eyes ache. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the deep ache in his muscles from 3 days of forced confinement, and turned back to the heavy oak door. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the warm, powdery scent of the babies. Clara was sitting by the hearth, wrapped in one of his oversized flannel shirts, nursing Lily, while Leo slept soundly in the wooden drawer. The firelight danced across her pale skin and the dark, heavy curtain of her hair. Elias stopped in the doorway, a sudden, strange tightness gripping his chest. For a decade, the silence of this cabin had been his penance. Now the soft sounds of this woman and these children filled the spaces he had deliberately left hollow. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Clara looked up, her gray eyes immediately guarded. "Storm's past," Elias said gruffly, pulling his leather gloves from his belt. "I'm going to dig out the wagon and hitch the draft horses. We need supplies and you need proper clothes. We're going into Pine Ridge." Panic flashed across Clara's face, sharp and immediate. She pulled the flannel tighter around the nursing infant. "Pine Ridge? Elias, no, we can't. The babies are too small to travel in this cold. I can make do with what I have." Elias frowned, stepping fully into the room. "I'm not taking you out to freeze. I have heated bricks and heavy buffalo robes for the wagon bed, but we're out of flour, low on salt pork, and you need heavy boots if you're going to survive out here. Besides, I need to report to Sheriff Miller that I found abandoned infants on my property line. It's the law." Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The law. The law in this territory was bought and paid for by men with money and cattle, men exactly like Silas Blackwood. If she rode into town, if anyone recognized her, Silas would know exactly where she was. He would tear Elias Thorne's life apart to get to his heirs. "Elias, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go into town." Elias's pale blue eyes narrowed, studying the sheer terror vibrating through her small frame. "You told me you were a traveler, a stranded widow who found these babies in the snow. If that's the truth, Clara Smith, you have nothing to fear from a town full of ranchers and merchants, unless there's a reason you're hiding." The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the unsaid. Clara looked away, staring into the flames. She was trapped. If she refused to go, he would leave her here and report the babies himself, drawing the town's attention anyway. "I'll get them ready," she conceded softly, the fight draining out of her. 2 hours later, the heavy wooden wagon crunched through the deep, unbroken snow toward the settlement of Pine Ridge. Elias sat on the driver's bench, the reins of the massive Clydesdales wrapped around his gloved hands. Behind him, under a mountain of heavy furs and heated stones, Clara huddled with the twins, completely obscured from the biting wind. The ride was agonizingly silent. Elias's mind was a storm of its own. He hadn't brought a woman into Pine Ridge since Eleanor. He knew exactly what the town would do. They would stare. They would whisper. The widowers and the gossips would dissect every inch of Clara and the mysterious infants. His grip tightened on the leather reins until the leather creaked. He was a man who craved invisibility, and today he was riding straight into the center of the town's prying eyes. When Pine Ridge finally came into view, a rough-hewn collection of timber buildings, saloons, and a single church spire, Clara pulled her heavy woolen hood low over her face. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Abigail Mercer's general store and apothecary. He tied off the horses, his movements stiff and deliberate, then turned to help Clara down. When his large hands gripped her waist to lift her from the wagon bed, the sheer physical strength of him sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Keep your head down," he murmured close to her ear. "Let me do the talking." The bell above the general store door chimed merrily as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, cured leather, and pipe tobacco. Abigail Mercer, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, looked up from the ledger on the counter. Her eyes widened, dropping from Elias's scarred face to the heavily cloaked woman beside him, and finally to the 2 squirming bundles in Clara's arms. "Lord Almighty, Elias Thorne," Abigail breathed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought the winter had finally swallowed you whole. And who, pray tell, is this?" "Abigail," Elias said smoothly, though his posture remained rigid. "I need flour, sugar, coffee, and whatever infant supplies you carry. Flannel, mostly." Abigail's sharp eyes darted to Clara. "Infants? Plural?" She rounded the counter, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. "Bring them to the stove, girl, before they catch their death. Let me see." Clara hesitated, looking up at Elias. He gave her a single, reassuring nod. Moving to the cast-iron stove in the center of the store, Clara carefully peeled back the blankets, revealing the sleeping faces of Leo and Lily. Abigail gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Before Abigail could launch into a barrage of questions, the cheerful chime of the front doorbell rang out again. But this time the sound seemed to slice through the warm air like a straight razor. The temperature in the room plummeted. Elias's back went entirely rigid. He didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. He knew the heavy, arrogant tread of those custom-made leather boots. He knew the cloying smell of expensive imported cigars that always preceded him. Well, well, if it isn't the ghost of Bitter Creek, a smooth, oil-slick voice echoed through the store. Silas Blackwood. Clara stopped breathing. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. She instinctively turned her back to the door, hunching her shoulders and pulling her hood lower, using her body to completely shield the babies from view. Elias turned slowly. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway, flanked by two armed ranch hands. Silas was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored wool suit beneath a beaver pelt coat that cost more than most men made in a decade. His silver hair was perfectly combed, but his dark eyes were flat, dead, and entirely ruthless. "Blackwood," Elias growled, the name tasting like ash and bile in his mouth. His right hand instinctively drifted toward the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. 10 years. It had been 10 years since Silas Blackwood's men had dammed the river upstream, cutting off the water supply to Elias's original claim, forcing Elias to move his pregnant wife and young son in the dead of winter to find a new homestead. The storm had caught them on the open plains. Eleanor and Thomas had frozen to death in Elias's arms, while Blackwood sat by a warm fire counting his new acreage. "You're looking remarkably well, Elias, considering the weather," Silas said, stepping further into the store, his dark eyes scanning the room. "I heard a rumor you finally froze to death out on that miserable patch of rock you call a ranch. Clearly, the devil doesn't want you yet." "And clearly heaven won't take you," Elias replied, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. "State your business and get out of my way." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. But his attention had shifted. His predatory gaze locked onto the trembling, hooded figure of the woman standing by the stove. "I didn't realize you were entertaining company, Thorne. A woman? You? After all this time playing the tragic, grieving widower?" Clara squeezed her eyes shut, praying to God the babies wouldn't wake and cry. If Silas heard their cries, he would demand to see them. If he saw them, he would recognize the distinctive Blackwood features in Leo's face. Silas took a step toward the stove. "It's rude not to introduce a lady, Elias, especially one carrying such heavy bundles. Turn around, sweetheart. Let me look at you." Elias moved with a speed that defied his massive size. In a fraction of a second, he placed himself squarely between Silas and Clara, his broad chest entirely blocking Blackwood's view. The air in the general store snapped with explosive tension. Blackwood's hired guns rested their hands on their holsters, but Elias didn't even flinch. He stared Silas down, his pale eyes burning with a decade of suppressed murderous rage. "Take another step toward her, Silas," Elias whispered, the softness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "And I'll paint Abigail's floorboards with your brains," Abigail gasped, backing away behind her counter. Silas stopped, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. He calculated the odds. Elias Thorne was a known marksman, a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You always were a dramatic savage, Thorne," Silas sneered, adjusting his lapels. He looked at Elias's protective stance, a cruel smile touching his lips. "So, the ghost finally found himself a warm bedmate. Who is she?" Elias didn't blink. He knew the territorial laws intimately. A woman traveling alone was vulnerable to anyone with money and power. A woman employed and claimed by a landowner, however, fell under the landowner's absolute legal protection. "She is Clara," Elias said loudly, his voice echoing in the wooden room, making sure Abigail and the men at the door heard every syllable. "She is my hired housekeeper and my ward. She resides on my land, under my protection. Anyone who bothers her answers to my rifle." Silas raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the territorial display. He tipped his hat mockingly. "A housekeeper? How domestic. Keep your stray, Thorne. I have no interest in your scraps." He turned on his heel and walked out, his men following close behind. The bell chimed merrily as the door shut, mocking the lethal tension left in their wake. Elias stood perfectly still for 5 full seconds, waiting until he heard the crunch of their boots fade into the snow. Then he let out a harsh, ragged breath and turned to Clara. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand, her face buried in the baby's blankets, stifling a sob. Elias reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders, grounding her. "Get the supplies, Abigail," he ordered, not looking away from Clara's terrified gray eyes. "Box them up. We're leaving, now." As Elias escorted Clara out the back door of the store to avoid the main street, he felt the heavy, undeniable weight of a storm much worse than the blizzard gathering on the horizon. He had just claimed this woman in front of his greatest enemy. He had painted a target on his own back to protect a stranger. And as he looked at the sheer, unadulterated terror in Clara's eyes, he realized the truth. Silas Blackwood wasn't just mocking him. Silas had been looking for someone. And Elias Thorne had a sinking feeling he had just brought exactly what the wolf was hunting right into his own home. The ride back to the cabin was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The sun had begun its early winter descent, casting long, bleeding shadows of purple and bruised blue across the snowfields. The cold had returned with a vengeance, but Elias felt nothing but the white-hot inferno burning in his chest. He drove the team of horses hard, his jaw locked so tight his teeth ground together. The encounter with Silas Blackwood had torn the scabs off wounds he had spent 10 years trying to freeze over. The memory of Eleanor's face, pale and lifeless in the snow, superimposed itself over the blinding white landscape. And sitting right behind him, huddled under the firs, was a woman who had nearly suffered the exact same fate. When they finally reached the cabin, Elias didn't speak. He carried the heavy crates of supplies inside, slamming them onto the kitchen table with unnecessary force. He stoked the fire aggressively, stabbing the burning logs with an iron poker until sparks flew onto the stone hearth. Clara remained completely silent, moving like a ghost. She took the babies to the far corner of the room, settling them into their drawer, keeping her back to Elias. She could feel the violent energy rolling off him in waves. He was a tightly coiled spring, and she knew she was the one holding the hammer. He had defended her. He had stood between her and the devil himself, claiming her as his own to keep her safe. The guilt in her stomach was a living, gnawing thing. He hated the Blackwoods. The pure, undiluted hatred in his eyes when he looked at Silas had been terrifying. If he knew that she carried the Blackwood name, that the babies sleeping by his fire shared the blood of the man who had destroyed his life, he would throw them out into the snow. He would have to. Night fell, wrapping the cabin in impenetrable darkness, save for the flickering orange glow of the hearth. The twins had finally fallen asleep after a long, fussy hour. Clara sat on the edge of the small cot Elias had set up for her near the fire, her hands resting in her lap, her exhausted body craving sleep she knew would not come. Elias was pacing the length of the parlor, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He couldn't shake the adrenaline of the town. He needed to do something with his hands. "I'm going to sweep," he muttered abruptly, grabbing the straw broom from the corner. It was a mundane, ridiculous task at 9 o'clock at night, but he needed the physical motion. Clara pulled her feet up onto the cot to get out of his way. Elias swept the hearth, moved toward the kitchen, and then approached the area around Clara's cot. As he swept beneath the heavy wooden frame of the bed, the broom bristles caught on something metallic. It made a sharp clinking sound against the floorboards. Elias paused. He leaned down, his massive frame dwarfing the small space, and reached under the cot. His calloused fingers brushed against a cold, heavy piece of metal. He pulled it out into the firelight. It was a heavy silver locket attached to a broken chain. Clara, who had been staring blankly at the fire, turned her head. When she saw what was resting in the palm of Elias's massive hand, all the blood drained from her face. Her lungs seized. She couldn't breathe. "No. God, no." Elias stood up slowly. He looked at the intricately carved silver. He didn't need to open it. He knew the crest etched into the metal. A wolf's head, surrounded by thorns. The Blackwood family crest. He had seen it stamped on the legal papers that had stolen his land. He had seen it on the saddles of the men who had driven him into the storm. The silence in the cabin became a physical pressure, heavy enough to crush bone. Elias slowly raised his eyes from the locket to Clara's face. The pale blue of his irises had darkened to the color of storm-tossed ice. There was no anger in his face. There was nothing at all. The absolute blankness of his expression was the most terrifying thing Clara had ever seen. "Elias," Clara whispered, the word tearing from her throat. "A traveler," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with a hollow, deadly calm. "A stranded widow who found 2 babies in the snow." He stepped toward her, his towering shadow swallowing her completely. He held the locket up by its broken chain, letting it dangle between them like a hangman's noose. "Tell me," Elias said, the deadly softness of his voice cutting deeper than a shout. "Did Silas send you? Is this a new game? He couldn't break me 10 years ago, so he sends a spy with 2 wailing infants to soften me up before he burns my ranch to the ground." "No." Clara scrambled off the cot, falling to her knees on the rug before him. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and desperate. "No, Elias, I swear to God. Silas didn't send me. He's hunting me. He's hunting them." She pointed a trembling finger toward the sleeping twins. Elias's jaw locked. He looked at the babies, then back down at the weeping woman at his feet. "You wear the Blackwood crest. You cowered when Silas walked into that store. I want the truth, Clara. And if I catch you in one more lie, I will put you on a horse tonight, and you can take your chances with the wolves." Clara choked on a sob, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. The dam broke. The secret she had carried through the blizzard, the burden that had nearly killed her, poured out in a rush of broken words and breathless terror. "My name is Clara Vance, Clara Blackwood," she confessed, the name burning her tongue. "My husband was Thomas Blackwood, Silas's nephew." Elias flinched, as if she had struck him with a whip. Blackwood. He had brought Blackwood blood into his sanctuary. He had fed them, warmed them, and stood in front of a gun for them. "Thomas was a monster," Clara wept, her voice shaking violently. "He drank, and he liked to use his fists. When I got pregnant, I thought it would change him. It didn't. 2 months ago, he got into a brawl over a card game in Cheyenne. He was shot dead." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her gray eyes locking onto Elias's with a fierce maternal desperation. "Silas came to the funeral. He didn't care that Thomas was dead. He only cared about my stomach. Thomas was his only blood heir. Silas told me that as soon as the children were born, he was taking them. He said a fragile, weak-minded woman like me wasn't fit to raise Blackwood heirs. He had papers drawn up to commit me to an asylum in Denver the moment I delivered." Elias stood frozen, the silver locket cutting into the palm of his clenched fist. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was perfectly aligned with the Silas Blackwood he knew. "When my water broke early, I knew I had to run," Clara continued, her words tumbling over each other. "I paid a midwife to help me deliver in secret in the back of a wagon. As soon as I could walk, I took them and ran. I heard rumors at the stage stations. People talked about a man named Thorne, a man who lived entirely alone, who hated the world, who shot trespassers on sight." Elias's eyes widened slightly. I thought if I could get to your land, Silas's men wouldn't dare cross your fence line. I was going to leave the babies in your barn. I knew you were a decent man beneath the rumors." I knew you would take them to the authorities or the church, where Silas couldn't easily claim them without a fight." She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But the storm hit, and I couldn't leave them. I couldn't walk away. The fire crackled, a sharp pop that echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. Elias looked at the woman kneeling on his floor. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't an enemy. She was a victim of the exact same monster who had destroyed his life. Silas Blackwood had taken Elias's wife and child, and now he was trying to take Clara's. But the twins... Elias turned his gaze to the wooden drawer. Those tiny, fragile infants, the ones he had rocked to sleep, the ones whose cries pulled at the deepest strings of his heart. They were Blackwood's. They carried the blood of the man who had murdered his family. A violent, sickening war raged in his chest. Hatred for the bloodline fought against the undeniable, fierce instinct to protect the innocent lives he had saved from the snow. Elias slowly opened his hand. He tossed the silver locket onto the floorboards. It clattered against the wood, the Blackwood crest gleaming mockingly in the firelight. He didn't say a word. He turned his back on Clara, walking over to the heavy oak door. He grabbed his coat and his Winchester, pulling the door open to the freezing, pitch-black night. "Elias," Clara called out, her voice a fragile, broken thread. "Where are you going?" "I need air," Elias rasped, his voice devoid of all emotion. He stepped out into the biting cold and slammed the door shut behind him, leaving Clara alone with the ghosts of the Blackwood name and the terrifying uncertainty of what the morning would bring. Elias Thorne stood in the freezing, pitch-black Wyoming night until he couldn't feel his fingers or his toes. He stood there until the biting wind scoured his lungs and the sheer, brutal silence of the snow-covered plains forced his mind into sharp, painful clarity. Blackwood. The name was a curse, a poison that had seeped into the very soil of his life 10 years ago. Silas Blackwood's greed had driven Elias's pregnant wife and young son into a storm exactly like the one that had just passed, stripping Elias of everything he loved. For a decade, Elias had sustained himself on a cold, steady diet of isolation and hatred. And now the blood of his enemy was sleeping in a wooden drawer beside his hearth. Elias leaned his forehead against the rough, frozen bark of a towering pine tree, squeezing his eyes shut. He pictured the silver locket. He pictured the twins, tiny, helpless, their cries entirely innocent of the sins of their grandfather. And then he pictured Clara. He remembered the sheer terror in her gray eyes, the way she had thrown herself to the floor, expecting him to cast her out to die. She was a victim of Silas Blackwood just as much as Eleanor had been. Silas viewed her as livestock, a vessel for his heirs, and intended to lock her away in an asylum the moment she outlived her usefulness. If Elias turned her away now, if he let his hatred for a name condemn a desperate mother and 2 innocent infants to the snow or to Silas's cruelty, he would become the very monster he despised. He would be no better than the men who had watched Eleanor freeze. Elias pushed off the tree, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. Silas Blackwood thought he owned the territory. He thought he could manipulate the law to reclaim his property. But Elias knew the territorial codes intimately. He knew the one legal fortress Silas's money couldn't breach. It was a drastic, irreversible move. But out here on the frontier, survival rarely asked for permission. Dawn was just bleeding a pale, bruised purple across the eastern horizon when Elias finally pushed the cabin door open. A blast of frigid air swept inside, making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Clara was awake. She hadn't slept a wink. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, fully dressed in her damp, wrinkled gown, holding both Leo and Lily in her arms. Her bags were not packed. She had nothing to pack. But her posture was that of a woman waiting for the executioner. When she looked up at Elias, her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Elias didn't take off his heavy buffalo hide coat. He walked to the center of the parlor, his massive frame dominating the space, and looked down at her. "Elias, please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Give me an hour. Just let me feed them once more by the fire, and I'll take them and walk. I swear I won't bring him to your door." "You wouldn't make it 2 miles in the drifts," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that betrayed none of the war he had fought all night. "And Silas's men are likely already watching the stage roads." Clara bowed her head, a tear slipping free to land on Leo's dark hair. "Then what do you want me to do?" "I want you to put your boots on," Elias commanded softly. Clara flinched, holding the babies tighter. This was it, then. He was sending her out. "Put your boots on, Clara," Elias repeated, stepping closer. "Because we are going back into Pine Ridge, and we're going to wake up Sheriff Miller." Clara looked up, panic flaring in her chest. "The sheriff? Elias, no! If you turn me over to the law, Silas will have his lawyers there by nightfall. He'll take them." "He won't," Elias said, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unshakable intensity. "Because territorial law dictates that a woman's legal guardian holds ultimate authority over her and any children in her care. Right now, you are a runaway widow. To the courts, you are vulnerable, unstable. And Silas can easily argue you are unfit. But if you are claimed, legally and permanently, by a landowner of good standing, Silas's custody petitions are worthless." Clara stopped breathing. She stared at the rugged, scarred rancher, her mind struggling to process his words. "Claimed? What are you saying?" Elias knelt down on one knee so he was eye level with her, his massive presence suddenly sheltering rather than intimidating. "I am saying that I will not let that bastard take another life from my land. I am saying that we are going to the sheriff's office and you are going to marry me, Clara." The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the cabin for 10 agonizing seconds. "Marry you?" Clara breathed, the words barely audible. "Elias, you hate my family. You hate my name." "I hate Silas Blackwood," Elias corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't hate you, and I don't hate these children. If you take my name, Clara, you become Clara Thorne. These babies become my legal dependents. Silas would have to go through me, my rifle, and the federal courts to get within 10 feet of you." He reached out, his calloused, gloved finger gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "I am offering you a fortress. Will you take it?" Clara looked into the icy blue eyes of the man who had saved her from the storm. There was no romance in his proposal. It was a tactical maneuver, a shield forged from iron and necessity. But beneath the gruff exterior, she saw the profound protective honor of a man willing to sacrifice his solitary peace to save a woman he barely knew. "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Yes, Elias, I will." The wedding was as cold and unadorned as the Wyoming winter. Sheriff Tobias Miller, a man with a graying mustache and a profound respect for Elias Thorne, opened his office door in his long johns and a heavy robe. He took one look at Elias's grim face and Clara's terrified, exhausted demeanor, and didn't ask a single question. "You're sure about this, Elias?" Tobias asked quietly, pulling the heavy ledger from his desk as Elias stood rigidly beside Clara. "Write it down, Tobias," Elias said, his hand resting lightly, protectively on the small of Clara's back. "And seal it with the territorial stamp. 2 copies, one for your safe, one for me." Within 15 minutes it was done. Clara signed her name with a shaking hand. Clara Thorne. She looked at the ink drying on the parchment, a surreal dizziness washing over her. She was a wife again. But this time, she hadn't been sold to a monster by a desperate father. She had been pulled from the snow by a protector. The ride back to the cabin was different than the day before. The suffocating tension of the lie was gone, replaced by the heavy, intimate reality of their new arrangement. When night fell over the Thorne Ranch, the true weight of the marriage certificate settled over the cabin. Elias locked the heavy deadbolt on the front door and dropped the iron crossbar into place. He turned to the parlor. Clara was folding the flannel blankets she had used on the cot, her movements slow and hesitant. "Leave those," Elias said quietly, stepping into the room and unbuckling his gun belt, laying the heavy Colt on the table. "You're not sleeping out here anymore." Clara froze, her heart giving a violent lurch. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "Elias, The cot is fine. I don't want to intrude on your space. The parlor drafts are too cold at night, and the cot is barely fit for a dog," Elias replied smoothly, though a faint, dark flush crept up his thick neck. "Silas has men everywhere. If anyone rides out here to snoop, it needs to look like a real marriage. A husband and wife don't sleep in separate rooms." He gestured toward the open door of the cabin's single bedroom. "You'll take the bed. I'll bring the twins' drawer in." Clara swallowed hard. She walked into the bedroom. It was sparse, dominated by a heavy, handcrafted timber bed frame covered in thick wool blankets and a massive bearskin pelt. It smelled of cedar, wood smoke, and Elias. Elias carried the wooden drawer containing the sleeping twins and set it carefully near the cast-iron stove pipe that radiated heat into the room. Then he walked to the wooden wardrobe, pulled out 2 spare thick pillows, and tossed them squarely down the absolute center of the mattress, creating a distinct, unmistakable wall. "I take the side by the door," Elias said, his voice gruff, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "You take the side by the wall. I won't cross the line, Clara. You have my word." Clara felt a rush of profound gratitude, mixed with a strange, entirely inappropriate flutter low in her stomach. "Thank you, Elias." They readied for bed in a tense, hyper-aware choreography. Elias stepped out to the parlor to let her change. When he returned, wearing only a pair of worn flannel trousers, Clara was already under the heavy furs on her side of the pillow wall, her back turned, her dark hair spilling over the white linen. Elias blew out the lantern and slid into the bed. The mattress dipped under his immense weight. The darkness amplified everything. Clara lay perfectly still, her breath shallow. She could hear the deep, steady rhythm of Elias's breathing just inches away. She could feel the intense, radiating heat of his large body bleeding through the thick blankets, crossing the pillow wall with ease. It was the most physically imposing, intimidating presence she had ever shared a bed with, yet for the first time in years, she felt absolutely untouchably safe. Elias lay flat on his back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, staring up at the invisible ceiling. The scent of her, something like crushed lavender and warm milk, invaded his senses, tying his stomach into knots. He had been alone in this bed for 3,650 nights. Now there was a woman beside him, his wife. He closed his eyes, gritting his teeth as the excruciating, agonizingly slow burn of desire warred with his ironclad sense of honor. It was going to be a very, very long winter. 4 days passed in a fragile, suffocatingly intimate domestic rhythm. Elias and Clara operated in a breathless orbit around each other. The pillow wall remained intact every night. But the physical awareness between them was a taut wire, thrumming with every accidental brush of an elbow at the kitchen table. Every time their fingers brushed when Elias handed her a fussy baby, Clara found her eyes lingering on the broad, scarred expanse of Elias's shoulders as he chopped wood. Elias found himself losing his train of thought entirely when Clara smiled down at the twins. But out on the frontier, peace was an illusion, and Silas Blackwood was a man who didn't take defeat lightly. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Elias rode out to check the northern fence line, leaving Clara and the babies secured inside the cabin. The sky was an ugly, bruised gray, threatening more snow. Elias guided his gelding along the barbed wire boundary. Something caught his eye in the snowdrift near the creek. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the crusty snow, and walked toward the dark shape. It was a yearling calf. Dead. Elias knelt beside the carcass. There were no wolf tracks, no bullet wounds. He pulled off his glove and inspected the animal's muzzle. Foam, frozen solid, crusted its lips, Elias stood up, his blood running cold, and looked toward the creek that flowed down from the higher elevations owned by Silas Blackwood. Poison. Silas had poisoned the water runoff. Elias turned sharply toward the fence line. 2 heavy wooden posts had been axed through, the barbed wire snipped clean, leaving a gaping hole in his boundary. Silas wasn't going to use the courts. He knew the marriage certificate would tie him up in legal red tape for years. Silas was reverting to the old ways. He was going to starve Elias out, burn him out, or kill him, and take the babies from the ashes. Hyah! Elias vaulted into the saddle, digging his spurs into the gelding's flanks. He rode hell for leather back toward the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst through the front door, bringing a gust of icy wind with him. Clara jumped, dropping the rag she was using to wipe down the table. "Elias, what is it?" she asked, seeing the sheer, violent urgency in his eyes. "Pack a bag with the baby's things," Elias barked, striding to the gun cabinet. He unlocked it and pulled out a double-barreled shotgun, a box of shells, and 2 extra revolvers. "Don't go near the windows. Keep the fire low so there's no smoke from the chimney." Clara's hands began to shake. "Silas?" "He cut the fences and poisoned the creek," Elias said grimly, loading the Winchester with practiced, lethal efficiency. "He's trying to smoke us out. If he thinks we're intimidated, he'll push harder." Night fell like a heavy shroud. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint, dying embers in the hearth. Elias sat in a wooden chair by the front window, the Winchester resting across his thighs, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. Clara sat on the floor near the bedroom door, the wooden drawer with the twins pulled close to her knees. The silence was agonizing. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie, unnatural stillness over the snow-covered valley. Then Elias smelled it. Acrid, sharp, the unmistakable scent of burning kerosene and dry wood. Elias shoved the shutter open an inch. Across the yard, flames leapt into the black sky. The storage shed, which housed their winter feed and Clara's meager supplies, was a towering inferno. "Bastards!" Elias hissed. If the fire jumped the 20 yards to the barn, he would lose the horses and the milk cow. Without the animals, they would freeze or starve in a week. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me," Elias ordered, standing up and cocking the rifle. "Elias, no. They're waiting for you out there," Clara cried, scrambling to her feet, grabbing his forearm. Her fingers dug into his thick coat. "I have to stop the fire from reaching the barn," Elias said, looking down at her terrified face. He reached up, his large hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing her jaw in a brief, shockingly tender gesture. "Lock the door, Clara." He threw the door open and sprinted into the freezing night. The heat of the burning shed hit him in a wave. Elias ran toward the water trough, grabbing a heavy bucket. He didn't make it 2 steps. Crack! A bullet slammed into the wooden post of the porch, sending splinters flying into Elias's cheek. Crack! Crack! Gunfire erupted from the tree line just beyond the glow of the flames. Elias dropped the bucket, diving behind the heavy wooden water trough as bullets chewed up the snow and dirt around him. He leveled the Winchester over the lip of the trough, squinting into the darkness. He saw a muzzle flash in the pines and fired blindly, the heavy recoil punching his shoulder. A man yelled in pain, the sound carrying over the roar of the fire. "Thorn!" a voice echoed from the dark. "Send the woman and the bastards out, and we let you live. Keep them, and we burn you all alive." "Go to hell!" Elias roared, firing 2 more shots into the trees. He was pinned down. There were at least 5 men in the tree line. If they flanked him, he was dead, and Clara and the babies would be defenseless. He had to get back inside. Waiting for a lull in the shooting, Elias sprang up and sprinted for the cabin porch. Bullets bit the logs around the door. He threw his shoulder against the oak, shouting, "Clara, open it!" The door flew open. Elias dove inside, hitting the floorboards hard as Clara slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron crossbar into place. "Are you hit?" Clara fell to her knees beside him, her hands frantically running over his chest and arms in the dark, searching for blood. "Elias, are you shot?" "I'm fine," Elias gasped, catching his breath. He grabbed her hands, stopping her frantic searching. He looked at her in the dim, flickering light coming through the bullet holes in the shutters. She wasn't crying. She wasn't cowering. Her jaw was set, her gray eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying maternal rage. Clara reached over to the table, grabbed the heavy, double-barreled shotgun Elias had left out, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside the barricaded window. She cracked open a box of shells, her hands surprisingly steady. "Tell me how to load it," she demanded, her voice hard as flint. Elias stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the gunfire outside. This woman, this beautiful, desperate, unbreakable woman, was willing to sit in the line of fire and fight a war against a cattle baron to protect her children and her home. Her home. The emotional dam Elias had spent 10 years building shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Another volley of bullets hit the cabin, shattering a glass pane above their heads. Glass rained down. Elias lunged forward, throwing his massive body over Clara, shielding her from the debris. They crashed to the floorboards, Elias hovering over her. His breath ghosted across her face. The smell of gunpowder, pine, and pure adrenaline surrounded them. Clara looked up into his pale, burning eyes, the shotgun forgotten in her hands. "I won't let them take you," Elias growled, his voice a raw, primal vibration in his chest. "I won't let him touch a single hair on your head, Clara. You are mine." Clara's breath hitched. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the danger or the past or the lies. She reached up, twisting her fingers into the collar of his shirt, and pulled him down. The kiss was desperate, bruising and explosive. It was a collision of 10 years of starvation and weeks of agonizing, silent longing. Elias groaned, a deep, guttural sound, his large hands tangling in her dark hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. He tasted like smoke and salvation. Clara kissed him back with a fierce, consuming heat, pouring all her fear, her gratitude, and her sudden, overwhelming love into the slide of her lips against his. Outside, the wolves of the frontier were howling for their blood. But inside the dark, smoke-filled cabin, surrounded by the terrifying chaos of a siege, Elias and Clara forged a bond that neither bullets nor fire could ever break. Elias tore his mouth away, both of them panting, their foreheads resting against each other. "Load the gun, Mrs. Thorne," Elias whispered, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. "Let's show these bastards whose land they're standing on." The phantom heat of their kiss still lingered on Clara's lips, a stark and burning contrast to the freezing draft pouring through the shattered window. But there was no time to process the seismic shift that had just occurred between them. The frontier did not pause for romance, and Silas Blackwood's hired guns were reloading. "Stay low!" Elias roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in Clara's ears. He grabbed the heavy oak dining table, flipping it onto its side, with a deafening crash to create a barricade between the window and the bedroom door. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees behind the overturned table, her skirts dragging over broken glass. She dragged the wooden drawer containing Leo and Lily securely against the heavy timber base. The babies were screaming now, terrified by the explosive noise and the sudden drop in temperature. "Shh, shh, my darlings, I'm here," Clara chanted frantically, her hands shaking as she draped a heavy wool blanket over the top of the drawer to shield them from flying debris and the biting cold. Crack! Thwack! 2 more bullets tore through the cabin, embedding themselves deep into the ceiling logs, raining sawdust down like dirty snow. Elias crouched beside the window, his massive frame tight with lethal concentration. The fire from the burning storage shed cast long, dancing shadows across the snowy yard, illuminating the tree line. It was a tactical advantage for Elias. The flames backlit the attackers, turning them into silhouettes against the white snow. Elias leveled the Winchester. He didn't fire blindly this time. He took a steady, controlled breath, his pale blue eyes tracking a shadow moving between the pines. He exhaled slowly. Bang! A scream echoed from the tree line, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow. "That's one," Elias grunted, working the lever action with a smooth, metallic clack. He glanced back over his shoulder. "Clara, the shotgun!" Clara picked up the heavy, double-barreled weapon. It felt massive and awkward in her hands, but the adrenaline surging through her veins gave her a terrifying clarity. She cracked the breech just as Elias had shown her days ago, her trembling fingers shoving two thick brass shells into the chambers. She snapped it shut with a sharp click. "It's loaded," she called out, keeping her head ducked behind the thick oak table. "Keep it aimed at the back door," Elias ordered, his eyes never leaving the window. "If they realize they can't get through the front, they'll try to flank us through the kitchen." As if on cue, a volley of suppressing fire erupted from the trees, peppering the front of the cabin to keep Elias pinned. Over the deafening roar of the gunfire, Clara heard a sound that chilled her blood to absolute zero. Footsteps. Heavy boots crunching softly on the snow, creeping around the side of the cabin toward the rear kitchen entrance. Clara's breath hitched. She looked at the wooden drawer holding her babies. She looked at Elias, whose broad back was to her as he returned fire out the front window. He couldn't cover both doors at once. Clara tightened her grip on the shotgun. She crawled out from behind the table, putting herself directly between the kitchen door and the twins. She knelt on the floorboards, raising the heavy stock to her shoulder. It was incredibly heavy, but she braced her elbows against her ribs, aiming the twin steel barrels directly at the center of the wooden back door. The handle rattled. Clara swallowed hard, her finger resting lightly against the cold metal of the trigger. "Elias!" a voice shouted from outside the front window. "You're a dead man, Thorne. We're burning you out." A flaming torch arched through the night sky, thrown from the tree line. It landed squarely on the wooden shingles of the cabin's porch roof. The dry, weathered wood immediately caught, casting a terrifying, flickering orange glow through the bullet holes in the shutters. "Damn it!" Elias swore. He fired two rapid shots, dropping the man who had thrown the torch, but the fire was already spreading. At that exact second, the back door of the kitchen splintered. A heavy boot kicked the lock. The wood groaned, giving way with a violent crash. The door flew open, letting in a swirl of snow and a hulking, bearded man wearing a heavy duster. He stepped into the dim kitchen, raising a revolver. He didn't see Elias. He saw a terrified, slender woman kneeling on the floor, blocking the path to the parlor. He smiled, a cruel, yellow-toothed grin, and cocked the hammer of his gun. "Well now, ain't you a pretty little—" Clara didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She thought of Silas Blackwood locking her in an asylum. She thought of her babies being raised by monsters. She squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening, concussive blast that illuminated the kitchen in a blinding flash of yellow fire. The sheer recoil of the weapon threw Clara backward, slamming her shoulders hard against the floorboards. The blast caught the intruder square in the chest. He was lifted off his feet, thrown backward through the doorway and out into the snow, his revolver clattering uselessly against the porch steps. He didn't get back up. Elias spun around at the sound of the blast, his heart stopping in his chest. "Clara!" He abandoned the window, sliding across the floor to where Clara was sitting up, rubbing her bruised shoulder, her ears ringing violently. The shotgun lay smoking across her lap. She looked up at him, her face pale, smudged with soot and gunpowder, but her eyes were fiercely, impossibly alive. "I got him," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged pants. "The back door is clear." Elias stared at her, a profound mixture of terror, awe, and overwhelming pride seizing his throat. He hauled her to her feet, pulling her fiercely against his chest for one brief, bruising second. "You're incredible, you hear me? You are incredible." He pushed her gently back behind the barricade. "Reload, stay down." Elias grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the cot, dumped a bucket of drinking water over it, and dragged a chair to the front door. Keeping low, he shoved the door open just enough to reach the burning porch roof, violently beating the flames with the soaked blanket. Bullets whizzed past his head, tearing through the wet wool. But Elias didn't retreat until the flames were entirely smothered. He slammed the door and threw the bolt, chest heaving. The siege dragged on into the darkest hours of the night. The remaining 3 men realized they were facing a fortified, heavily armed nightmare instead of an easy bounty. They retreated into the tree line, taking sporadic potshots at the cabin, trying to freeze Elias and Clara out. The temperature inside dropped drastically. Clara pulled the babies from the drawer, tucking both of them inside her heavy coat, pressing them against her bare skin to keep them warm. Elias paced the perimeter of the room, checking every window, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set like granite. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a barrier. It was a shared ironclad vow of survival. Hours bled away. The darkness began to thin, giving way to the cold, gray light of dawn. Suddenly, the sporadic gunfire from the tree line ceased. Elias pressed his ear to the cold logs. Then he heard it. The unmistakable, thunderous sound of a dozen horses galloping hard across the crusted snow. "Hold your fire!" a booming voice echoed across the valley. "This is Sheriff Tobias Miller. Put down your weapons or be shot on sight." Elias let out a long, ragged breath, his forehead resting against the cold window frame. He looked back at Clara. She was slumped against the overturned table, her chin resting on Leo's dark hair, fast asleep from sheer exhaustion, still clutching a shotgun shell in her soot-stained hand. The siege of Bitter Creek was over, but Elias knew the war had just begun. The morning sun illuminated a scene of absolute devastation. The storage shed was nothing but a pile of smoldering black ash. The front porch of the Thorne cabin was chewed to splinters, the logs pockmarked with bullet holes, and the shattered windows let the biting Wyoming wind howl freely through the parlor. Sheriff Tobias Miller stood in the center of the wreckage, his boots crunching on broken glass, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Outside, his deputies were loading the bodies of Blackwood's hired guns into a wagon and binding the hands of the 2 who had surrendered. Elias sat on the edge of the hearth, a heavy blanket draped over his shoulders, watching Clara. She was sitting in his rocking chair, softly humming as she nursed Lily. Despite the soot on her face and the dark bruises under her eyes, Elias had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. "Looks like you went through hell and back, Elias," Tobias said quietly, shaking his head. "One of the men we caught confessed. Said a wealthy man in Pine Ridge paid them $500 to burn you out and retrieve a stolen asset. He didn't name Silas, but we all know. Knowing and proving are 2 different things in this territory, Tobias," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe," Tobias replied, his mustache twitching. "But attempted murder and arson are federal crimes. I've sent a wire to the U.S. Marshals in Cheyenne. In the meantime, I've got enough cause to drag Silas in for questioning." "You won't have to drag him far," Elias said, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he looked out the shattered window. Rolling down the snow-packed lane toward the cabin was a polished, enclosed black carriage, drawn by 4 pristine, matched Morgans. It was escorted by 3 armed riders wearing the Blackwood brand on their heavy coats. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled her dress up, clutching Lily tightly to her chest. "Elias." "Stay here," Elias commanded softly. He stood up, letting the blanket fall from his shoulders. He checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver, snapping it smoothly back into place, and walked out the front door. Sheriff Miller followed right behind him, his hand resting on the butt of his own gun. The carriage rolled to a halt in the yard, mere feet from the smoking ruins of the shed. The door opened, and Silas Blackwood stepped down. He looked impeccable, untouched by the freezing cold or the violence of the night. But when his dark eyes swept over the bullet-riddled cabin and landed on Elias Thorne, standing tall, uninjured and lethally calm on the porch, a flicker of genuine shock crossed Silas's face. He quickly masked it with a sneer. A second man stepped out of the carriage. He was older, wearing a thick beaver hat and carrying a leather briefcase. Elias recognized him instantly. Judge Higgins, a territorial judge known to have deep pockets, mostly lined with Blackwood money. "Sheriff Miller," Silas said, completely ignoring Elias, "I am glad to see the law has arrived. I have come to reclaim stolen property and see a kidnapper brought to justice. The only criminals here are the men you hired to burn my house down, Silas, Elias said, his voice echoing in the crisp morning air. I have no idea what you're talking about, Thorne, Silas lied smoothly, adjusting his leather gloves. He turned to the judge. Judge Higgins, if you would. Higgins pulled a thick stack of parchment from his briefcase, clearing his throat. Elias Thorne, I hold here a writ of guardianship, granting Silas Blackwood full legal custody of the infant children Leo and Lily Blackwood. Furthermore, I hold a territorial arrest warrant for one Clara Vance on charges of kidnapping and mental instability, ordering her immediate remand to the Denver State Asylum. But Clara, standing in the doorway with Leo and Lily in her arms, let out a stifled sob. Silas looked at her, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. It's over, Clara. Bring me my heirs, and you won't have to wear iron shackles on the train ride to the madhouse. Elias slowly descended the wooden steps of the porch. His boots crunched on the snow until he was standing a mere 5 feet from Silas. The sheer physical menace radiating from Elias made Blackwood's hired guards shift nervously in their saddles. Those papers aren't worth the ink they're written on, Silas, Elias said softly. They are signed by a territorial judge, Thorne, Silas snapped, his composure slipping. You have no legal right to harbor that woman or my blood. She is a vulnerable widow, an unfit mother, and she belongs to the Blackwood family. Elias reached into the inside pocket of his heavy coat. He didn't draw a gun. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment, stamped with the red wax seal of the territorial law. Elias unfolded it slowly, holding it up for Judge Higgins to see. She isn't a widow, Elias said, his voice carrying the immovable weight of a mountain. And she isn't Clara Vance. Her name is Clara Thorne. She is my wife. The absolute silence that fell over the snowy yard was deafening. Judge Higgins squinted at the paper, his face drained of color. He looked at Sheriff Miller, who tipped his hat. I officiated the ceremony myself, Judge, Tobias said cheerfully. Perfectly legal. Filed in the county ledger 3 days ago. Under territorial law, Elias continued, his pale eyes burning into Silas's suddenly pale face. A married woman falls under the absolute legal protection and guardianship of her husband. Her children are my legal dependents. You have no claim to my wife, Silas, and you have no claim to my children. Silas Blackwood stared at the marriage certificate. His jaw trembled. The impenetrable legal trap he had spent thousands of dollars to build had just been shattered by a single piece of paper. He had lost the heirs. He had lost the bloodline. He had been outmaneuvered by a dirt-poor rancher he thought he had broken 10 years ago. The humiliation and rage twisted Silas's face into something demonic. You son of a bitch, Silas hissed, spit flying from his lips. You think a piece of paper stops me? You think you can steal my blood? Logic abandoned him. Driven by pure blinding fury, Silas's hand darted beneath his heavy coat, reaching for the pearl-handled revolver holstered at his waist. He never even cleared the leather. Elias Thorne's draw was a blur of motion, a terrifying display of frontier muscle memory. Before Silas's gun could even point forward, a deafening crack echoed across the valley. Bang! Silas screamed, stumbling backward into the carriage. His pearl-handled revolver, shattered into a dozen pieces of metal and ivory, blasted right out of his grip. Blood immediately blossomed across the back of his right hand where the bullet had grazed the skin, tearing the gun away. Elias stood perfectly still, his Colt leveled directly at the center of Silas's forehead, smoke curling lazily from the barrel. Blackwood's armed escorts immediately went for their rifles, but Sheriff Miller and his deputies already had their weapons drawn and cocked. Hands off the iron, boys, Tobias roared. Unless you want to hang for firing on a sheriff. The guards slowly raised their hands, backing their horses away. Silas was on his knees in the snow, clutching his bleeding hand, staring up at Elias in absolute shock and agony. Elias slowly walked forward, looking down at the man who had haunted his nightmares for a decade. The ghost of Eleanor and Thomas stood beside him in the snow. But for the first time in 10 years, they weren't screaming in the storm. They were quiet. They were at peace. 10 years ago, you drove my family into the snow and watched them die, Elias whispered. The words meant only for Silas. Today, you tried to burn my family alive. But my family survived, Silas, and you have absolutely nothing left. Elias lowered his gun and turned his back on the broken cattle baron. Sheriff, Elias said over his shoulder, get this trash off my land. With pleasure, Tobias said grimly. He stepped forward, grabbing Silas roughly by the collar and hauling him to his feet. Silas Blackwood, you're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and discharging a weapon with intent. Get in the wagon. Elias walked back up the porch steps. He didn't look back as the carriage and the wagons turned around, taking the shattered remnants of the Blackwood Empire away from Bitter Creek forever. He stopped in the doorway. Clara was standing there, tears streaming freely down her soot-stained cheeks, holding Leo and Lily tightly against her chest. Elias dropped his gun belt onto the floorboards. He reached out, his massive arms wrapping around all three of them, pulling them into the solid, unyielding warmth of his chest. Clara buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of smoke, pine, and the man who had fought a war to keep her safe. The winter storm was finally over. The ice had broken, and Elias Thorne held the spring in his arms. The Wyoming winter did not surrender easily. But when it finally broke, it gave way to a blindingly beautiful resurrection. By late April, the suffocating drifts of white had melted into rushing, crystal-clear streams. The valley surrounding Bitter Creek exploded into a vibrant canvas of emerald-green grass, dotted with the bright purple of wild lupine and the yellow of prairie sunflowers. The air no longer tasted of ice and wood smoke. It smelled of damp earth, blooming pine, and the sweet, intoxicating promise of life. Elias Thorne stood shirtless on the front porch of his cabin, the midday sun baking the sweat into his broad, scarred shoulders. He swung a heavy iron hammer, driving a thick square nail into the final cedar plank of the new porch railing. The bullet holes that had scarred the logs 3 months ago were patched and sealed. The ashes of the storage shed had been cleared away, replaced by a larger, sturdier timber barn. He lowered the hammer, wiping his brow with the back of his leather-gloved hand, and let out a long, satisfied breath. Inside the cabin, the heavy wooden shutters were thrown wide open, letting the warm spring breeze sweep through the parlor. From the kitchen window, Clara watched him. She held a sleeping Lily against her shoulder, gently swaying back and forth. Leo was already asleep in the beautifully carved twin crib Elias had built by hand over the last month. The babies were 4 months old now, plump, healthy, and entirely oblivious to the war that had been fought for their survival. Clara leaned her forehead against the window frame, her heart doing a familiar, helpless flutter as she watched the muscles in Elias's back ripple under the sun. So much had changed. 2 weeks ago, Sheriff Miller had ridden out with the final news from Cheyenne. Silas Blackwood had been indicted by a federal judge on multiple counts of conspiracy, attempted murder, and arson. Without his money to bribe the marshals, and with Elias's airtight testimony, Silas was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial penitentiary. The Blackwood Empire had collapsed overnight, its assets seized to pay off decades of illicit debts. The wolf was gone. The shadow over their lives had evaporated like the morning mist. But with the danger eradicated, a new suffocating tension had settled over the Thorne cabin. For 3 months, their marriage had been a shield. They had survived the winter sharing the same bed, divided by a line of pillows that had become a tormenting physical barrier. They had fought side by side, raised the twins together, and built a domestic rhythm so profound that Clara couldn't remember how her lungs had ever drawn breath before she met him. But Elias had offered her his name to save her life. He was a man of fierce honor and unyielding duty. Now that she no longer needed saving, Clara was terrified that he would ask for his solitude back. He had never said the words, "I love you." He had protected her, provided for her, and looked at her with an intensity that made her blood burn. But the foundation of their vows was still inked in survival, not romance. Clara set Lily down gently beside her brother in the crib. She smoothed her cotton skirt, took a deep breath, and picked up a tin cup of cold water from the pump, walking out the front door. The wooden screen door slapped shut behind her. Elias turned, his pale blue eyes immediately softening as they landed on her. He pulled off his work gloves, tossing them onto the railing. "You finished the porch," Clara said softly, handing him the tin cup. "I did," Elias said. He drank the water in 3 long gulps, his Adam's apple bobbing. He handed the cup back, his gaze dropping to her face and staying there. "The stagecoach from Pine Ridge is running on its regular schedule again. The passes are clear all the way to Denver." Clara's heart plummeted into her stomach. Her fingers gripped the rim of the tin cup until her knuckles turned white. This is it, she thought, a cold dread washing over her. He's telling me the roads are open. He's telling me I'm free to go. "I know," Clara managed to say, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. She looked down at the freshly cut cedar floorboards. "The danger is past, Elias. Silas is locked away. He can never hurt us again." She swallowed the massive lump forming in her throat. You don't have to keep pretending anymore. You gave up your peace for me. You fulfilled your vow. If you want the marriage annulled, now that it's safe, I will understand." The silence on the porch was deafening, save for the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines. Elias stared at her, his brow furrowing deeply. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance until the heat radiating from his skin enveloped her completely. "Pretending?" Elias repeated, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver straight down Clara's spine. He reached out. His large, calloused hands, the hands that had fired rifles, chopped wood, and rocked her babies to sleep, gently grasped her waist. "Clara, look at me," he commanded softly. She slowly raised her eyes. The pale, icy blue of his irises had completely melted. They were burning with a fierce, naked emotion that stole the breath right out of her lungs. "I haven't pretended for a single second since the day I pulled you out of the snow," Elias said, his thumb brushing against the soft curve of her hip. "I didn't marry you just to cheat Silas out of his heirs. I married you because the thought of you walking away from this ranch, of someone else having the right to protect you, tore me to pieces." Clara's lips parted, a tiny gasp escaping her. "Elias." "10 years ago, I died out there in the cold," Elias confessed, his voice thick with an emotion he had buried for a decade. "I built this cabin to be my tomb. But then you brought the spring right to my doorstep. You and Leo and Lily. You gave me my life back, Clara." He moved his hands up, cupping her face, his thumbs gently sweeping over her cheekbones. "There will be no annulment. There will be no leaving. Not unless you look me in the eye and tell me you don't want to be my wife," Elias whispered, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "Because I love you. I love you with everything I have left in this world. And if you stay, I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Tears spilled over Clara's lashes, hot and fast, but this time they were born of pure, unadulterated joy. The heavy, crushing weight of her insecurities shattered into dust. "I don't want to leave," Clara wept, throwing her arms around his thick neck, pulling herself flush against his bare, scarred chest. "I love you, Elias. I have loved you since the night you stood between me and the fire. You are my home. You are my only home." Elias let out a ragged, triumphant breath. He didn't hesitate. He crushed his mouth to hers, kissing her with a desperate, consuming hunger that had been starved for 3 agonizing months. There was no holding back, no pillow walls, no fear of the morning. The kiss was a vow, a claiming, a total surrender of 2 battered souls who had finally found their safe harbor. Clara kissed him back fiercely, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, tasting the salt of his sweat and the sweet promise of forever on his lips. When Elias finally swept her up into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of the cabin and toward the bedroom, she didn't look back at the door. She only looked at him, That night, the wall of pillows was unceremoniously thrown onto the floorboards, never to return. Twilight settled over Bitter Creek, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant strokes of amber, violet, and gold. Inside the cabin, the hearth crackled with a low, comfortable fire, warding off the evening chill. Elias stood by the bedroom door wearing a clean linen shirt and his trousers. He held a cup of coffee, but his attention was entirely focused on the corner of the parlor. There, bathed in the soft golden light of the lantern, stood the beautifully carved twin crib. He walked over to it silently. Leo and Lily were fast asleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison. They were no longer fragile, freezing strangers left in the dark. They were Thorn children, strong and deeply loved, entirely unburdened by the legacy of the name they had left behind. Elias reached out, his calloused finger gently tracing the edge of a small oak frame mounted on the log wall directly above the crib. Inside the glass, smoothed out and preserved forever, was the wrinkled, water-stained piece of parchment he had found pinned to the sheep's wool on the coldest dawn of the decade. Please love them. Soft footsteps approached from behind. Clara wrapped her arms around Elias's waist, pressing her cheek against his broad back, sighing in absolute contentment. Elias placed his hand over hers, holding her tight against him. He looked at the note, then down at the sleeping infants, and finally turned his head to kiss the top of Clara's dark hair. "I don't just love them," Elias whispered into the quiet, peaceful cabin, his voice filled with a reverence that resonated in his very soul. "I love the life that brought them to me."